Case 1, Harlem, New York, a cold November night in 1935. The kind of cold that bites through wool coats and settles in your bones. Outside the Cotton Club on 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue, a line of white patrons stretched down the block. Fur coats, diamond cufflinks, laughter that echoed off brownstone walls. Inside Duke Ellington's orchestra was warming up. The sound of jazz, black genius packaged for white consumption, spilled onto the street. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson approached the entrance. Tailored suit, polished shoes, a man who carried himself like he owned the block, because in many ways he did. The doorman stepped forward, white, broad-shouldered, a smirk already forming. "Private event tonight." Bumpy didn't blink. "I can see the line. I'll wait." The doorman's smirk widened. "Not for you. Yet this is a whites-only establishment." The street went quiet, not silent. Harlem was never silent, but the kind of quiet where people stop mid-conversation, where eyes shift, where everyone knows something is about to happen. Bumpy stood there, 6 feet tall, calm, dangerous in the way a coiled spring is dangerous. "You sure about that?" His voice was low, controlled. The doorman leaned in, close enough that only Bumpy could hear the vile words that followed. Racial poison, degrading, deliberate. Bumpy's jaw tightened. His hands stayed at his sides. And then he walked away. No shouting, no swinging, no scene. Just a man in a tailored suit, disappearing into the Harlem night. The doorman laughed. The white patrons filed inside. The music played on. But what happened next would shake New York's most powerful criminals to their core. That before we see what Bumpy did, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story travels. To understand what Bumpy Johnson did next, you need to understand what the Cotton Club really was. It wasn't just a nightclub. It was a crime scene dressed in sequins and spotlight. By 1935, Harlem had become the most famous black neighborhood in America. The Harlem Renaissance had put it on the map. Writers like Langston Hughes, musicians like Louis Armstrong, artists who turned suffering into beauty. White intellectuals called it a cultural awakening. But the Great Depression had shattered that dream. Clubs closed, newspapers folded, rents went unpaid. Black families who'd migrated north, searching for opportunity, found themselves trapped in overcrowded tenements, working jobs that barely paid enough to survive. And yet, white fascination with Harlem only grew. Downtown New Yorkers wanted the thrill of Harlem nightlife without the reality of black equality. They wanted jazz without justice, danger without risk, black culture on their terms. The Cotton Club gave them exactly that. Owned by Oni Madden, a white gangster and bootlegging kingpin, the club was a money-laundering operation disguised as entertainment. Prohibition had made Madden rich. The Cotton Club made him respectable. The decor, plantation imagery, palm trees, fake jungle scenes. The floor shows trafficked in racial caricature. Black performers playing exaggerated exotic versions of themselves for white amusement. Black waiters served white customers. Black musicians entertained white audiences. Black cooks prepared white meals. But black customers? Forbidden. Well, this wasn't an accident. It was policy, rigidly enforced, widely known. Even wealthy, famous black patrons were turned away at the door. The club's entire business model depended on one thing: letting white people experience Harlem without ever having to share space with the people who actually lived there. If you were a musician needing that paycheck, but hating that stage, what would you do? Comment below. But one man refused to accept that this was just how things were. In 1935, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wasn't yet a legend. He wasn't the mythologized godfather you'd see in movies decades later, but he was already the most dangerous man in Harlem. Not because he was the most violent, though he could be brutal when necessary. Not because he was the richest, though money flowed through his hands like water. To Bumpy Johnson was dangerous because he was smart. He ran the numbers racket, illegal lottery games that functioned as Harlem's underground banking system. In a neighborhood where legitimate banks refused black customers, where mortgages were denied, and loans came with predatory interest rates, the numbers game was how people survived. A nickel bet could turn into grocery money. A lucky hit could pay rent for 3 months. Johnson didn't just take bets. He paid out ill-fairly. He employed hundreds. He kept the system running. But that wasn't what made him different. Bumpy Johnson read poetry. He quoted Shakespeare in conversation. He donated to churches and paid school tuition for kids whose parents couldn't afford it. He funded funerals so families could bury their dead with dignity. He also broke bones when necessary. This combination, intelligence, violence, and community integration, made him nearly untouchable. He wasn't isolated from Harlem's legitimate leadership. He knew the ministers, the lawyers, the educators. He moved between the criminal underworld and respectable society with ease. He'd survived the brutal gang wars of the early 1930s, particularly the bloody conflict with Dutch Schultz, a white mobster who'd tried to muscle in on Harlem's numbers game. When Schultz was assassinated in October 1935, Johnson emerged as Harlem's primary power broker. He understood something most criminals didn't. Violence was loud, temporary, and invited retaliation. But economic pressure? That was quiet, cumulative, difficult to prosecute. And when he was humiliated outside the Cotton Club that November night, he didn't reach for a gun. But he reached for something far more dangerous. A plan. Bumpy Johnson didn't make decisions in anger. He made them in silence. The night after the Cotton Club incident, he sat in the back room of a Harlem speakeasy, surrounded by men who understood power the way most people understand breathing. Policy runners, enforcers, fixers, men who controlled supply chains, labor networks, and information flows throughout Harlem. Johnson didn't rant about the doorman. He didn't talk about revenge. He talked about math. The Cotton Club makes money because everything runs smooth, he said, lighting a cigarette. Musicians show up on time. Liquor gets delivered. Health inspectors look the other way. Customers feel safe. He leaned forward. What happens when things stop running smooth? The plan was elegant in its simplicity. No bombs, no bullets, and no dramatic confrontations that would bring police heat or newspaper headlines. Just friction. Musicians who worked at the Cotton Club would suddenly receive better offers from competing venues. Venues Johnson quietly funded. If they stayed, fine. If they left, the club scrambled to replace top talent. Liquor suppliers who serviced the Cotton Club would experience unexpected delays. Shipments would arrive late. Bottles would break in transit. Nothing illegal, just unreliable. Kitchen staff would call in sick more often. Not a strike. That could be broken. Just individual decisions, made independently, that happened to cluster at inconvenient times. And health inspectors, the ones who'd been paid to ignore violations. They'd suddenly remember their jobs. Johnson made calls. Quiet conversations. Favors called in. Pressure applied in places Oni Madden couldn't see. No threats, no violence. Just a systematic campaign to make the Cotton Club's operations expensive, unpredictable, and exhausting. Within weeks, The Cotton Club started bleeding money. If you're hooked, smash that like button and stick around, because this gets wild. Only Madden was not a man accustomed to problems he couldn't solve with money or muscle. He'd built an empire on bootlegging during Prohibition. He'd survived gang wars, federal investigations, and rival mobsters who'd tried to take him down. He controlled politicians, police captains, and judges. But by December 1935, the Cotton Club was falling apart, and he couldn't figure out why. It started small. A saxophone player didn't show up for rehearsal. The replacement was mediocre. Customers noticed. And then the liquor delivery arrived 6 hours late, on a Saturday night, the busiest night of the week. The club ran out of champagne by midnight. High-paying customers left angry. The following week, 3 waiters called in sick on the same night. Service slowed to a crawl. More complaints. A health inspector showed up unannounced, something that hadn't happened in years. He found violations, minor ones, but enough to require fixes, expensive fixes. Then the piano tuner canceled. The backup generator failed. A pipe burst in the kitchen. The laundry service lost an entire shipment of tablecloths, so none of it was catastrophic, but all of it was constant. Madden called meetings. He threatened staff. He replaced suppliers. He threw money at problems. Nothing changed. What made it worse, what made it maddening, was that he couldn't identify an enemy. Well, there were no demands, no threats, no one taking credit, just an endless series of small disasters that added up to chaos. His managers were exhausted. His performers were unreliable. His profit margins were shrinking, and in the back of his mind, a suspicion was forming. This wasn't bad luck. This was coordinated, but by who? He'd made enemies, plenty of them, but this kind of operation required reach, organization, someone who controlled Harlem's infrastructure from the inside, someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure. What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments, and then the Cotton Club's star performer made a move no one saw coming. Duke Ellington stood in his dressing room, staring at a contract offer that had appeared on his table. It was from the Savoy Ballroom, a Harlem venue that, unlike the Cotton Club, actually welcomed black patrons. The offer was generous, competitive, and it came with something the Cotton Club could never provide: dignity. Ellington wasn't naive. He knew where the money behind the Savoy's sudden expansion was coming from. He'd heard the whispers. Bumpy Johnson's name floated through Harlem like smoke. Everywhere and nowhere at once. This was a choice. Stay at the Cotton Club, endure the humiliation, keep the national radio exposure, or leave, risk his career, but perform for people who actually respected him. He wasn't the only one facing this decision. Cab Calloway received a similar offer. So did several backup musicians, all from venues that had mysteriously acquired new funding, better equipment, and booking agents who promised steady work. The musicians talked quietly among themselves. Had they understood what was happening? Someone was building an alternative, a way out. But leaving the Cotton Club meant gambling everything. It was the most famous jazz venue in America. It had made careers. Walking away could end them. Still, the constant equipment failures, the delayed payments, the growing tension between management and staff. It was becoming unbearable. One by one, musicians started making calls, testing the waters, asking questions, and when Madden's booking agent tried to lock them into longer contracts with stricter terms, several refused to sign. That's when Madden realized he was losing control. He called an emergency meeting with his top lieutenant. They sat in his office, door closed, voices low. "Someone's orchestrating this," Madden said. "Find out who." The answer came back within days. Bumpy Johnson. When the club's biggest draw walked into Madden's office with an ultimatum, everything changed. Only Madden prided himself on being a businessman first, a gangster second. He understood leverage, he understood markets, and by early 1936, he understood he was losing. The Cotton Club wasn't just bleeding money, it was becoming a liability. Staff turnover was constant. Performers were unreliable, customers were complaining, competitors were gaining ground, and all of it traced back to one man. Bumpy Johnson hadn't made threats. He hadn't demanded a meeting. He hadn't needed to. The message was clear. Change your policy or watch your investment crumble. Madden sat in his office, cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling, doing the math. Racism had been profitable. The whites-only policy was part of the brand. It's what made downtown customers feel exclusive, adventurous, safe. But that was before the costs started piling up, before musicians walked, before suppliers became unreliable, before every week brought a new headache that required money, time, and energy to fix. Madden was a criminal, but he wasn't stupid. He knew when he was beaten. Before we reveal what happened, hit subscribe. You don't want to miss how this ends. The decision wasn't moral, it was mathematical. Integration was cheaper than resistance. So, quietly, without press releases or public announcements, the Cotton Club's door policy changed. Black patrons, if they were well-dressed and well-behaved, could enter. Not in large numbers, not with fanfare. But the absolute ban was lifted. The doorman who'd insulted Bumpy Johnson, gone, replaced. Word spread through Harlem like wildfire. People tested it. A few black customers walked through those doors, sat at those tables and ordered drinks. The world didn't end. White customers didn't flee en masse. But something had shifted. The illusion of untouchability, the idea that white establishments could operate in the heart of black Harlem while excluding black people entirely, had cracked. And so, quietly, without fanfare, the Cotton Club's doors opened. But the victory was bittersweet. The Cotton Club's integration wasn't a triumph. It was a concession. Black patrons could now enter, but only under strict conditions. They had to be impeccably dressed. They had to behave appropriately. They were watched more closely than white customers, scrutinized, judged, and the numbers were controlled. A few black faces scattered among a sea of white ones. Enough to claim progress, not enough to change the atmosphere. For many in Harlem, it felt hollow. The club still profited from black talent while offering crumbs of access. The decor still evoked plantation fantasies. The ownership was still white. The money still flowed out of Harlem and into downtown pockets. Bumpy Johnson had won a battle, not a war, but he'd proven something crucial. Exclusion wasn't inevitable. Power could be challenged. Systems could be disrupted. And the people who controlled those systems, they weren't untouchable. By late 1936, the Cotton Club made another decision. It relocated, packed up, and moved downtown to Broadway, far from Harlem's streets. Officially, it was about expansion, better facilities, a larger audience. But everyone knew the truth. Then Harlem had become too complicated, too expensive, too difficult to control. The club that had built its reputation on exploiting black culture while excluding black people couldn't sustain that contradiction anymore. Not in the heart of the community it was exploiting. Downtown, the Cotton Club could return to its old ways, whiter audiences, fewer complications. But in Harlem, the lesson remained. Bumpy Johnson hadn't dismantled segregation. He hadn't freed his community from economic exploitation, but he'd cracked the facade. He'd shown that the system could be pressured, that dignity could be fought for, that power, when applied strategically, could force change. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a power move. But the story doesn't end there. What Bumpy Johnson did to the Cotton Club became a blueprint. Not immediately, not obviously, but the tactics he used: economic pressure, coordinated disruption, strategic patience, would echo through history. Decades later, the civil rights movement would employ similar strategies: boycotts, sit-ins, refusing to participate in systems that demanded both labor and humiliation. The Montgomery bus boycott, the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins. These weren't just moral protests. They were economic warfare. They made discrimination expensive, unsustainable. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a civil rights hero. He was a criminal who used illegal methods for personal and community gain. He didn't march. He didn't preach. He didn't seek moral high ground. But he understood power. He understood that systems don't change because people ask nicely. They change when maintaining the status quo becomes more costly than reform. And the doorman who'd insulted him that November night, he was just a symbol, a face on a much larger machine, a machine that believed black people would always accept their place. That humiliation was just the price of survival. Johnson proved that assumption wrong. He didn't do it alone. He had networks, resources, people who trusted him enough to risk their livelihoods, the musicians who walked away, the suppliers who delayed shipments, the workers who called in sick. Resistance is rarely one person. It's a web of small decisions that add up to something larger. What's the weather like where you are? Sunny? Rainy? Let us know. Bumpy Johnson didn't dismantle segregation. He didn't end racism. He didn't transform America, but he cracked it. And sometimes a crack is all you need. The real crime in this story wasn't what Bumpy Johnson did. It was the system that made his methods necessary. A system where black artists created culture but couldn't enjoy it. Where black labor built wealth they'd never access. Where a man in a tailored suit could be turned away from a club in his own neighborhood simply because of the color of his skin. True crime usually focuses on violence because violence is loud. It leaves bodies, court records, headlines. But economic coercion? That's quiet. It happens in back rooms and delayed deliveries, in whispered conversations and strategic patience. It requires intelligence, coordination, an understanding of how power actually operates. Bumpy Johnson's genius wasn't brutality. It was knowing when not to use it. He made racism inefficient. He turned exclusion into a liability. He proved that even the most powerful systems have pressure points. And the question that remains for us today is this: when we face injustice protected by institutions, by wealth, by tradition, what do we do? Do we accept it as inevitable, or do we find the cracks? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The tools change. The tactics evolve. But the lesson stays the same. Power isn't just about who's loudest. It's about who's smartest. If this story moved you, share it. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe for more untold true crime history. And remember, power isn't just about who's loudest. It's about who's smartest. Case closed for now.